I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the general characteristics of what we might mean when we talk about primal cultures. It's the worldview, as if there is a worldview, it's extremely difficult for us to grasp, oftentimes, because our own has become so different from what once was, right? And the question remains, and there are always questions, how clearly have we ever really seen this topic? How clearly can we understand it? Well, let me draw out a few general characteristics and see if we might be able to figure out something that we can talk about. There is a term in religious studies, manna, M-A-N-A, not the manna that one might find in the Jewish scriptures or the Christian Old Testament. That's a different kind of manna. It might have this manna in it, but it's not the same. Manna is a term that is used to recognize a sense in which one finds in Native peoples that the world is, as I touched on before, very much alive in and of itself, that it is not a ball of dirt, right, on which we live, or stardust, as the case may be, that it is in and of itself a living being. Now, as a young man and a hippie, I related to this very much because that was one of the things that in the 50s and 60s began to take hold in popular culture, was a different way of understanding the world, not just as a thing, but as a biosystem of which we are a part, a living organism, right? Which has presented us in many ways with a choice as to whether or not we are friendly to our host or whether or not we are parasitic to the point where the host itself is in danger of dying. I think I touched on that last week as well. I can tell you this, in my time teaching in Hawaii and speaking with some of the Native peoples in Hawaii, their attitude toward the land and toward the ocean was not quite like anything I have ever encountered. The awe with which they spoke of it, the care they were committed to taking of it, and unfortunately the difficulties that they were having and are still having with, for instance, corporations who have come in and are using that land for their own purposes. That attitude toward the earth, that somehow it is beneath us, it is below us, right? That we are created in the image of God, right? You know the stories, many of you do, and the earth was given to us, and our job is to till it, right? But without really taking into consideration the earth in its own right, right? That is an extremely difficult attitude to alter. But as time goes on and we see more and more the trouble that we are causing ourselves and the other creatures, the more extremely difficult, the more extremely important it becomes to be aware and to make some attempt to alter our lifestyles, our attitudes and our lifestyles, not just for us, but certainly for future generations. Now, manna is understood to be especially present in places, in people, in things that are striking, that are remarkable, that are impressive, that are even awesome. A particular mountain or tree, you will find, comes to be considered a sacred place, a sacred space, if you will. And I don't think this is too terribly difficult to relate to. I would imagine that many of you have a particular place that holds some special significance for you, to which you might return to gather yourself, if you will. Right? Did you ever have a place like that when you were a kid that you still remember, that you might still return to from time to time? And there's a certain aura about it, right, that may or may not be connected with particular events that occurred there, that runs deep, perhaps even deeper than our intellectual understanding. Another thing about man is that it is transferable. It can be transferred from person to a person, from a person to a thing. It is a kind of power. Let me give you an example from a tradition which you might not consider to be tribal, but in its own day certainly was. There's a story about a group of specially blessed priests, right? You have to be specially blessed if you're going to mess with this stuff or have some kind of power inherent in you, right? A group of priests is carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the seat of the Most High God. Some of you know this story, right? From the Jewish tradition and Christian tradition. And this is not just any old box, okay? It's incredibly powerful, or certainly considered to be. And as they are carrying it in a procession down the road, one of the priests slips, apparently, and falls. And as he does so, the throne of the Most High God is about to fall into the dirt. When what happens? Well, some innocent bystander does what you or I might do. Reach up to steady it, right? And what happens when he does that? He is struck dead. He's struck dead, right? Now, did that actually happen? Remember we talked last week about myth, the nature of myth, right? It may or may not refer to actual historical events. Whether it does or not, it's a story that people tell to help explain to themselves who they are, right? And something about the world in which they live. It's a sign of respect, of power, and it entails particular behaviors. Rudolf Otto, who is was actually a German philosopher of religion, talks about a similar concept, and I'm going to give you a fancy word, okay? And you're going to be able to impress somebody with this one. And you already know what it is, whether you realize it or not, okay? Just think about it for a moment. Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. It's from the Latin, right? And I say you already know what it means. Mysterium would be the noun, so that would be what? Thank you for using your voices. Yes, it's okay. That's the mystery, right? Tremendum and fascinans are the adjectives, so it's a mystery that is tremendous and yet fascinating, right? Both frightening and yet fascinating. You are both repelled by it and yet drawn to it, right? And if you think about sacred objects down through the ages, it's very much this way. If you think about, in many cultures, blood is considered to be possessed of manna. That may not be the term that is used for it, but many of the sacred objects down through the ages are somehow connected to blood, or people in particular circumstances. Blood plays a role, right? I'll give you an example. Some tribal societies have separated the women during their menstrual periods, right? Because they are too powerful to be around. A soldier, before or after battle. Taboo, right? You have to be very careful about being around this person. Corpses, same thing, right? What do you think that is about? What might that be an indication of, do you suppose? I ask because I'm not really sure. Well, okay, let's go at it this way. Why blood? What do you think it is about blood that's powerful? Because I think it is for us to eat today. Oh, yeah. Very much connected with life, right? And you know that if you lose enough of it, yeah, exactly, no more life, right? No more life. But I find that to be a fascinating characteristic that these taboos rise up around how to handle the manna. And in these tribal cultures, oftentimes there is, well, one term that is used is a shaman, who is, you might say, a specialist in the handling of manna. Oftentimes a male, in some tribal cultures, females, right? And they, well, in the past they've been dismissed as medicine men or witch doctors. Again, you think about who is it that is describing these tribal cultures early on. To a person, pretty much, they were white, European, Christian males. Okay? White, European, Christian males. And so when they go into these areas, they really carry with them their own presuppositions, right? There's an immediate assumption that these people are, all too often there's an immediate assumption that these people are, demon worshipers, they're worshiping the devil. And what is at least as devastating, if not more so, is that there are those basic cultural assumptions that we need not only to convert these natives to our religion, but also to our culture. And again, I'm in Hawaii, and I'm talking with the descendants of those who lived there before the Europeans ever showed up. And you see the after effects of colonization, where their great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, their ancestors were taken out of their lives, right? The children were removed from them, their hair was cut, their language was outlawed, right? And I imagine for a moment that you're 6 years old, right? You're just about to go into school. In fact, let me make this even a little bit more relevant, perhaps. What if Hitler and the Nazis had won World War II? And the more I learn about that time period, the closer I realize they came to doing just that. What if they'd won, right? And if they still, owned the United States of America, which of course would no longer be the United States of America, so that when you were a child, you were taken from your parents, you were placed into a school, right? You were told that your culture, that what you'd been taught, the way your parents lived, was just wrong, right? And if you ever slipped up and used your native tongue, you would be punished for that. I mean, you know how important language is to just the formation of one's own identity. You can imagine the devastation, right? And it's a devastation that goes on from generation to generation. More recent scholars are at least attempting to be more aware of their, shall I say, our own cultural assumptions, right? And more open to the possibility of understanding another culture, not as a specimen, but perhaps even as an alternative, right? Certainly one that can stand on its own, and it's not necessarily inferior to the way that we assume life is or should be. Before we leave Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinosum, this too does not necessarily need to be something that happens on a mountaintop with a guru sitting there. Okay, I would imagine each of us has had a taste of something like this